The wide receiver cliff and what it means for 2025 and fantasy football drafts. That is what we are talking about today on the RotoViz Fantasy Football Podcast. My name is Colm Kelly. I'm joined today, I am glad to say, by the one, the only Pat Kerrane of legendaryupside.com. You'll know him from Ship Chasing as well. Some of the OG podcast listeners will know him from the RotoViz and RotoViz Radio airwaves. We had Kyle Dvorak on last week, and I asked him the question, can he consider himself a RotoViz OG? I think Pat can certainly slot himself into that category. But Pat, it's a fun time here at post-NFL draft as we really start to move forward towards the NFL season. How are you feeling on this Wednesday afternoon? Wednesday morning for you, in fact.
I would consider myself more RotoViz second wave. I was an OG reader, but I wasn't, when it was, Matthew Friedman and Frank and Davis and everybody kind of at the very beginning, Sean, of course, I was just reading it. I was reading it very regularly. It was like a couple years.
And I've had this conversation with Sean a couple of different times, and I kind of went into it a little bit with Kyle last week. But when you think back, like we're talking like that's say 12 years ago at this point, really 12, 13 years ago. But the amount of time then that you have spent in the industry or around RotoViz probably supersedes the amount of time that you, like by quite some time, that you were actually reading. So it's always interesting how our mind is molded in those early times.
Yeah. I was kind of in the Ben Gretsch. I was kind of with him.
You were like the class of 2015.
I was like the class of 2015. Yeah.
Valedictorian. But today we are jumping into talk, the wide receiver cliff. It was a question last week. We looked a little bit about the zero RB landscape with Kyle, and one of the questions that followed up a couple of different people had was to expand on the wide receiver cliff for this season and how maybe that changes the situation. Whether at this point of the year, it's obviously best ball drafts, but that'll obviously affect redraft and so on as we get into that particular point of the season. For this exercise, we'll be looking mainly at the FFPC ADP. Of course, the kind of wide receiver positional rankings and so on will kind of tether up a little bit with whatever platform you're playing on, whether it's Underdog or Drafters or wherever it is. But Pat, we're going to kick it off with a simple question. I think sometimes when we do these sort of exercises, we go in, we're like, every person watching this podcast knows what the wide receiver cliff is, which isn't the case. Some people are probably listening to this that were in that group with you reading the RotoViz stuff 12 years ago. Other people may be, entering their early fantasy life here as they get ready for the season. So how are you defining the wide receiver cliff for this season? I tend to go with where you want to have 4 to 6 wide receivers on your roster, but it also can be the case, like there can be multiple cliffs throughout the draft itself. But where are you feeling that the wide receiver cliff is this season, and how are you defining it?
Yeah, I mean, I think generally there's been some kind of rules of thumb in best ball drafts, especially where, this roster is the roster you're going to have all year. So, getting the right structure in place to kind of manage the chaos of the season is really important. Having 3 wide receivers through the first 5 rounds is kind of a general rule of thumb. Having 4 through the first 7 rounds is kind of another rule of thumb. Having like 5 wide receivers probably by round like 11-ish is sort of another rule of thumb, although sometimes people will try to have 5 by even round 9. So, I think that the wide receiver cliff idea comes from, what a lot of research shows that we want to be strong at wide receiver in these best ball leagues, that it's not a great idea to be underpowered at wide receiver, given the number of wide receivers that you can start, the power of having really good wide receivers, the ability to find production at running back a little bit more easily, and also production at running back that, like, when you find a guy, he's your guy, like a Bucky Irving from last year isn't just like a spike week or 2, like he's your new starter. Yeah. So that tends to happen more at running back than receiver. And so you can position yourself, if you do have, 4 wide receivers through like the first 7 rounds, you're generally going to be pretty strong and allow yourself some flexibility to move away from wide receiver in the rounds where we can get some of these high upside cracks at running back. You can attack quarterback in the quarterback window. Generally in that kind of like round 9 through 12 range, get some of those guys that aren't going to be super expensive, but still give you some upside at the position. You know, you might even be able to add an elite tight end in there. So there's lots of things you can do. But if you get behind at wide receiver, then all of a sudden you can really find yourself scrambling and kind of taking on guys that you're not really that excited about, just like praying that you have enough points at the position. So that's kind of the idea of like what we're trying to do with the wide receiver cliff. I'm kind of getting increasingly like skeptical that the wide receiver cliff really exists, in the sense that we're all kind of, maybe not all, but there's a lot of people drafting that have these rules of thumb in mind now, to the point that, especially in Underdog, I actually think it's affecting the ADP. So the idea that you have to have like 4 wide receivers through 7 rounds is a sort of helpful framework to make sure that you don't like, but what you're really saying is I don't want to get shut out of sufficient wide receiver firepower. But if you're forcing a wide receiver, if you're breaking a tie to a wide receiver in round 7, why don't you just take the other guy and then take a wide receiver in round 8 or even round 9 or even round 10? If you don't think there's that big of a difference between the players, I think forcing structure around the cliff is a mistake. It's one of the things that has gotten me into trouble in the past, where, you know, we talked about the Bateman line 2 years ago. That was where the wide receiver cliff was. You had to get basically Rashad Bateman. After him, it was a wasteland, but there were big hits actually behind Bateman. So if you had just said the Bateman line's fake, I'm not doing the Bateman line thing, it was actually a pretty big edge. So I think being very precise and identifying after this player, it's a cliff, that can be kind of dangerous, especially if you're in agreement with the field, right? That can kind of be dangerous, because we're likely to kind of be wrong about that. It's too chaotic of a sport.
You kind of moved into a couple of topics that as you like opened up. This is what I'm trying to do. No, with this show in general, though, is kind of like have very limited topic area and like expand in whatever way kind of the flow goes. And you mentioned a couple of things. So the 4 through 7 does allow for quite a bit of flexibility. You mentioned an elite tight end, but you know, even at that, if you have 4 wide receivers, you're still only at 5 out of your 7 players. So it is given a lot of flexibility. Again, some of the tiebreakers, I might push myself to the wide receiver, but I'm interested in like always how the landscape is evolving, what is changing. That conversation with Kyle last week, we talked through the potential 0 RB targets, the 0 RB rounds, and how they're looking a little bit different this year. And you're mentioning, you know, particularly an Underdog, when people know there is, you know, potentially a wide receiver avalanche and then a wide receiver cliff, everyone's kind of jumping in there to get the same things done and to see the same targets. And I'm almost looking at these rounds 10 through, you know, 20 or whatever amount of rounds you're drafting as that thing that we would always talk about with 0 RB targets, is like looking at the profiles and looking to see that there's going to be limited numbers of wide receivers you want to draft after the particular cliff. But I do think there is some very interesting names as well as you work your way down. And the one thing that you get a little bit worried there is, you know, each round I have 1 wide receiver I like. So that means from rounds, you know, 11 through 20, I might have 9 wide receivers. And if I'm drafting with Pat and Pat drafts Jaden Higgins, then I don't draft Jaden Higgins. And then you can get really locked out, and that can be the concern there. But it is a bit like you said about the tie breaks. Like if maybe you can't draft Jaden Higgins, but you could draft Tootin, you know, in that round 11 range, you kind of just need to know the structure and how the rest of the draft can play out. How are you feeling in general with the overall, like that landscape and how the board, I guess the draft board is changing a little bit over the years with people having more information, but also because they have that information, copying some of the stuff that, you know, we've been promoting, or you've been promoting the Legendary Upside as well, the RotoViz stuff over the years, and kind of going in that direction a little bit.
I think that's a huge part of it. Like when we were writing about, you know, these kind of structural concepts, and Sean's talking about 0 running back and everything, like that was not really like breaking through for a few seasons, and that's changed.
A few.
Where, I mean,
like I think we could say it's been widely adopted with the explosion of best ball, with Underdog in particular, with the 3 wide receivers. It's where it's like really in the last 3
but I'm
years.
saying, I mean, Sean wrote that article in like what, 2014,
2013, yeah.
2013. Yeah. So there was like
so it took a decade. Yeah. Pat, that's how long you've been reading the work.
Oh no. Oh no. So
we're old.
But there was like a thing where we were, at RotoViz, we were completely on board where, this is the way we're drafting and this is an edge, but we're operating within a landscape where most people are like, this is not an edge, it's dumb. And great, right? Because now I get to do this thing that we're openly discussing, but it's not affecting the market.
Yeah.
The market's shifted recently, and it's, I credit drafters, like things are changing more year to year, which I think is like the way it should go. Like we should be adjusting and trying to figure out. Yeah. Trying to figure out the lessons, like legit lessons, not just overreacting to the previous year, but, we're experimenting a little bit more with like, how should all these players be priced? And that shift makes it a little harder to kind of stick to the old rules, right? Because if the prices are changing radically, then it's just more difficult to kind of fall back on like things like draft 4 wide receivers through round 7. Like that's probably still good, but it's going to be a little less powerful if all the wide receivers are really priced up, like we're seeing last year. Like Christian Kirk's getting pulled into the 3rd round and stuff. And at the time, I was kind of like, well, I don't want to get locked out at receiver, but it's like,
didn't work out in hindsight.
No, but it wasn't ever really going to work out. No, like he's like a low upside, it's kind of like I sort of talked myself into doing something at receiver that I was, kind of making fun of at running back. Because, it's like basically
he's a dead zone wide receiver.
He was a dead zone wide receiver. We created a dead zone for wide receivers is really what happened last year, I think. And so we just have to be like careful about, not getting tied to these old rules of thumb too heavily. Daniel Raz writes for Legendary Upside, and he references Goodhart's law, which is when a target becomes a measure, it ceases to become a good measure. That's the law. Meaning, like, if everyone thinks that we should draft 4 wide receivers through round 7, then we probably shouldn't, because there's only so many receivers.
And certainly those wide receivers at the back end of that scale, like the wide receivers in round 1 and round 2 probably still fit the law.
Yeah.
But the wide receivers in round 5 and round 6 are probably should be going in round 8 and round 9. Basically, they're getting pulled up, and as you referenced there, into basically a wide receiver dead zone, because we would look at the running backs in previous years. The running back that should be going in round 9 is going in round 6, and we're like you were, that is great. We don't want that guy anyway. We don't want Mike Davis on our roster. Right. So we're just going to skip over that. And we're going to get the wide receiver at that position. But now we have to be aware that some of those wide receivers are getting really pulled up as well.
Exactly. So the receiver that you used to get in round 6 or round 7 just isn't of the same caliber that you would have gotten, back 3 years ago, even.
And even the wide receivers, the other part that has changed in this over the years is like young players, particularly rookies and second-year players, but specifically the rookies, they would have been in the double-digit rounds, even if they were an early pick, because it would take them time to adapt. And then that was an edge to draft them, and they were part of the 0 RB, like they were supercharged at the end of the season. Whereas now, these guys are going right at the top.
Depending on your tournament, I actually think that the rookies still are a pretty big edge, because you have to be crushing at the end of the season. But that is also true. The rookie prices have changed dramatically, and so you have to think a little bit more carefully about how you're getting that late season upside, and understanding that like you're probably accepting more risk than you used to get the late season upside, and so that then maybe that makes some less attractive profiles actually like slightly more attractive. And I'm talking about like a Joe Mixon type, where you're like, oh, obviously I'm not taking Mixon, obviously I'm not taking DeAndre Swift, but like some of these guys are like way cheaper than they ever been for that profile.
People would have said like with DeAndre Swift's a starting running back. DeAndre Swift's a starting running back for the Bears, so he's going to be in the 4th round.
But round. That's exactly what I was
he's in the 7th round. Like it's almost like
Underdog.
It has corrected itself almost to the correct point, if that makes sense. And at the correct point, then they become,
I think if a player's priced efficiently, we should consider him. And we're starting to see more efficient pricing. To me, the framework that I'm kind of like the thing, I think sort of the foundational framework that I'm trying to use this year is basically what can I get later? Like, how does this compare to what I can get later? And when you look at the wide receivers in like round 1 and round 2 on FFPC a little bit, I can't really get them later.
No.
Like Nico Collins, who's going like at the 204, it looks like here at FFPC. He's kind of more 1-2 turn on Underdog. I'm not really getting him later. Like that, he's incredibly efficient. He's locked in as the number 1. He's competing with rookies for target. He's got, at least good, maybe strong quarterback play. They've got an offensive coordinator change that I think, if anything, will be helpful for him. They're kind of lost their way a little bit last year. So that's not available late. That's not Christian Kirk in the 3rd round. That's a legit number 1 receiver guy who could compete to be like the highest scoring receiver in the playoff weeks.
Yeah.
But when you start to get down a little further, I think that's where, once you get to, it's more like kind of the 4th round, 5th round is where I start to have, I'm not sure I'm getting anything I couldn't get later. Maybe I'm taking on more risk later, but what do I get? Like when this hits, what do I get? And stuff like a Jameson Williams, he's been a tough click for me. It's like I think I get some boom bust production from a talented player, but one who doesn't draw a ton of targets in a pretty stable situation. It's hard for me to see the upside being fully unlocked for this guy, given everything around him. He is good, which makes me nervous to kind of make a bear case against him. But I'm like, if I'm looking, isn't he sort of Jordan Addison? He
is, and this is where I think the point earlier about the Deadzone come. These are players that might be speaking for you, but these are players that historically we've really, really liked and have targeted. But then Addison's going in the 6th round, Williams is going in the 5th round in terms of the FFPC format. But the thing
there's a bigger gap on Underdog, but there's still over around here.
But then when you go through the players, then that you're like, well, maybe Jameson Williams is maybe get something else later. But then you're looking at he's going with Rome Odunze, Cortland Sutton, just beside him. And I actually kind of like the 5th round guys, like it's Zay Flowers, Devontae Smith. But then you get into the veterans who we'll talk about in a minute, like Devontae Adams, DJ Moore, Mike Evans. There's an area there where it's if you're ranking the wide receivers, I think they're ranked pretty much correctly, but it's then the round value and the kind of draft capital you have to put into them that makes it a little bit challenging.
Yeah, even in the 3rd, it starts to get a little shaky. Like Terry McLaurin,
I think that force cliff for me is maybe even at Lad McConkey, but it's JSN at the back of the 2nd round.
I actually think Lad McConkey belongs ahead of that, but I do agree.
Is that
I think
your split kind of?
Yeah,
we love JSN, but I Sam Darnold is tempering my expectations quite a bit for this season.
For sure, and Kubiak as well. I don't think that this offense is not going to be built around the pass. I don't think. I mean, Darnold's. We have actually a pretty decent sample on Darnold, and most of it's not very good. And he's coming from an incredible situation.
Yeah,
truly an incredible situation. Goes to not so great of a situation. I mean, it's not horrible, but it's probably middle of the pack in terms of setting up a quarterback for success.
And he's never Cup really was done just well
booted from LA.
Outdoors either is a concern.
Yeah, that's. They did shore up the interior offensive line a bit, which is nice to see. And they added some Torrey Horton in the 5th round is kind of interesting as a flyer. Maybe he, between him and MVS, they should have a field stretcher. And then you've got 2 guys, at least one guy in JSN who can earn targets, and Cup who might, still be able to earn targets effectively. So it could be fine. They have 2 good running backs. It could totally be fine. We could also just see Darnold, crap the bed. We've seen that before. And if that starts to happen, I think this offensive coordinator will just start leaning on the run in a big way. And, JSN really does most of his damage is kind of a volume guy, just consistently out there earning targets. So if pass attempts drop, I'm not sure he's going to make up for it with a bunch of big plays. And you're talking about him at the 2-3 turn, or early third, at the latest. And it's I think that's a little pricey for Garrett Wilson, who I really like, but Justin Fields, it's not great, and they're going to be probably running a bunch. He's the clear number one there, but I think we would have gotten Garrett Wilson a few years ago in the 5th.
The player that really strikes me for that this season is Rome Odunze going in the 5th after what happened with his rookie season and the quarterback situation, and they draft a tight end and a wide receiver. I think he would be in the 9th, he's in the 5th.
Totally. Yeah, and Wilson, by the way, when in the 5th, I would have been gleefully taking him and making fun of people for letting him fall to the 5th. So it's not like I think he should be in the 5th.
Yeah,
but I'm just not. These price differences are meaningful, is my point. And so I take Garrett Wilson. We have him ranked right at ADP. I don't think he's a fade, but it's not as fun of a click as it used to be, and it makes you think a little bit about how you're building teams. So I tend to think that wide receiver, or wide receiver, tight end, wide receiver is pretty strong start. Even though I don't love the wide receivers in the 3rd round, I do take them. But even then, I'm this is more expensive than it used to be. And then as you move into the 4th and the 5th, frankly, as you move into the old dead zone, that's where I'm starting to be a little bit more open to the running backs actually this year, where you're getting guys, because you are getting guys when Ben wrote about the dead zone, even when running backs were much more expensive, and so you're having all these guys going off the board. A few years ago, I think there were 11 running backs selected in the 1st round. This is maybe 2021.
Yeah,
there's we're talking about 4 now. So there's just the 2nd round is scattered throughout the rest of the draft. The rest of the 1st round is sort of scattered throughout the early rounds. So and it's a little bit different. It's not the exact same player pool we had then, but the bets were probably better back then at running back a little bit. But it's also the case that we just have learned that we were overdrafting running back. And so
again, going back to the running back conversation, to kind of help with the wide receiver cliff element, is Kenneth Walker goes in the 4th round here, and Chuba Hubbard's in the mid 5th round, and I think they're players who would have been in the late 2nd, probably a couple of seasons back, and even the
late 2nd, early 3rd type of picks. Yeah. Chase Brown would have been the 201, 202. He's in the middle of the 3rd. So, funnily enough, Omar and Hampton, who's at the 3-4 turn, would probably have been at the 3-4 turn, or maybe even a little later, because we didn't value the rookies so much.
Yeah.
Najee Harris would be going higher. But it is Hampton, it is Travion Henderson and RJ Harvey, who I'm pretty interested in this range. But I am also interested in, unfortunately, the Joe Mixons and the Chubas, who are in round 5. And what one of the things that I took away from last year is if you get 10 weeks out of just a straight up kind of low end RB1, or maybe even mid range RB1, outside the top 4 rounds, that can, and the way that we tend to build, that can be pretty powerful. And I'm not pairing these guys together. I'm not going nuts. I'm not just oh my God, Kamara's here and Mixon's here and David Montgomery and James Conner. Oh dude, and you're gonna let me have Aaron Jones? I'm not. These guys serve a purpose to me. I'm how do I get the base?
I hope somebody clips that up, Pat. That has to be clipped.
I want the Bayshall Tootin hit to matter for my best ball team.
Yeah.
Right. I want to get through round 1, and then Tootin's going nuts in the playoffs, and I'm there to benefit. And so with like,
and I know this
much...
doesn't work for like specifically the context of the name, but like you could do like a hero RB kind of style build, but you're trying to get the wide receivers through the first 4 rounds, and then in the 5th through 7, you start to be like myself and Sean a couple of years ago. I think it's 2 seasons ago now, even in like the FFPC Main Event and things like that, we thought, and it didn't work out, but we thought that Ramondre Stevenson and Jameson Williams, that kind of cohort of running backs, along with these all worked out bad, Travis Etienne, were kind of in a group there where like they felt like they were mispriced. They all flamed out as the season went on, but it felt like the market was a bit wrong, and maybe at the end of this season we'll be wrong on these guys as well, but it does feel like there's a little bit of a market opportunity for some of the names going in the 5 through 7 range.
Yeah.
The one thing I want to do is I want to keep some of these names, and I'm not saying Joe Mixon's definitely not in this category for me, but our second show this week's going to be on the legendary upside running backs. We don't want to give away all the running backs on this.
Well, we're not, that's not a concern. That's I'm saying. That's not what I'm saying. But I do. It is like last year. That's what you're saying. Last year there was a group of running backs that were underpriced in round 8+.
Yeah.
And I'm like, man, these guys used to cost, like round 6, and you're getting them later. And if I take these running backs starting more like in round 8, I can really load up on wide receiver and make sure I'm strong enough at wide receiver to satisfy things like 4 through 7, make sure I'm not missing out before the wide receiver cliff and everything. But what it actually was is that you wanted to take the running backs kind of in the classic dead zone a little bit. And Kamara would sometimes fall so late that he was in that group, but I was kind of fading him as sort of a dead zone archetype type of back, which he was and still is. But when the price changes enough, I'm like, okay, but some of these bets that we're making at the like, we don't expect full seasons out of a lot of the running backs that I'm taking, and it's like if I can take on like a half season from a guy at really high end production, and it's the front half, that's much less.
That might be what you need to get Tootin through the first 7 weeks of the season.
It's less of a desirable. I don't want to just like load up on those bets, but I can take that bet and use it to unlock the back weighted stuff that I am definitely going to do. Like, I'm not losing sight of that. And I think we get that opportunity a little bit again this year. That's to me, that's what a Chuba Hubbard is for. He's a lot more expensive than last year. But he was really good last year. He ran really efficiently. And I think he'll be the kind of the 1A, lead rusher, maybe even the clear-cut lead rusher for them. And we could see the offense improve. And then like Mixon, like the only guy there is Woody Marks, who I was not impressed with as a prospect. He's kind of a third down back, really not like a hard runner. And, he's a decent enough pass catcher, I guess. But I don't think anyone's coming for that job. So it's like, I'm getting the starting running back on the Texans in the 5th round, and I really want to bet against Joe Mixon, but it's what I'm used to doing. But he used to cost an early 2nd round pick. And this profile used to cost at least like kind of a 3rd round pick. So getting him.
To go back to your point earlier on the wide receivers, can I get this later? Like, tell me the difference in Joe Mixon in the 5th and Josh Jacobs at the end of the 2nd.
Exactly. And so that's where, give me Ladd McConkey, right? You can have Josh Jacobs. I'll take Ladd McConkey. Then I'm going to take Mixon, and you can have Zay Flowers, which to me is a pretty massive gap in terms of the upside. Like, Mixon has very equivalent upside to Jacobs, which we saw last year. McConkey's upside in his 2nd year with Herbert being the number 1, given how efficient he was, I think is much higher than Zay Flowers. Even though Zay Flowers is a good player, it just, the situation is tough if you're looking for someone to like emerge, to be in the conversation just like week in, week out, like top 4 ranked receiver, top 5 ranked receiver, just like a PPR monster. That's tough to see for Zay Flowers. It's not really that tough for me to see with Ladd McConkey, given the rookie year that he had and the quarterback play. I know that they're not going to be super pass heavy, but the lack of competition for targets, and I do think they have a higher pass volume ceiling than Baltimore. So Yeah, I mean, it's kind of a game of like 2v2s that you're doing. You know, like what if I pass on this guy, can I get something later? And I am just more open to like, if you're going to give me workhorse production, you know, for a stretch, if you're going to give me that cheap enough, even though I do expect it to evaporate over the course of the season, then I will take it now, and I'll try to pair it with more back-weighted bets so that the team kind of is coherent. It's making a coherent attempt to, you know, advance and then crush. And Mixon, you're allowed to just sit on the bench and watch me win the championship with guys like Bashal Tutin or Cam Scattaboo or some of these more back-weighted guys that aren't going to be producing early on.
I can't believe I've like kind of been advocating to pick Joe Mixon. That's not something that I've done for many years, but it may be the way to play it this year. Just on
he's not the only one either. I mean, there's lots of, and I would say in this range, I mean, I do like Harvey and Henderson and Hampton. So it's not just the front weighted guys, because there are, you know, you can go get a James Conner. There is kind of a range here where you can get a DeAndre Swift, who makes me kind of nauseous to click, but I just don't see how he's not pretty involved in the beginning of the season. You know, it's like, it's just kind of tough to imagine like what else they do. Tony Pollard, you know, he's a fine enough click in like the 7th or 8th round. Like, I can use that production, you know. I'm not like squinting to see how he gets touches. I'm squinting to see how he doesn't get touches.
Yeah, it used to be a case of these guys you were saying like they are going to lose the job halfway through the season. Now you're like, how are they going to lose the job? Like, I like Tajay Spears, but at best they're probably splitting the role there.
He's not losing the job to Tajay Spears.
Yeah. The other part, so I think like we've talked through, the elite guys for me finishes at Lad McConkey. That's where like the red flags start. And you know, JSN, we like him. T. Higgins, I really like. Garrett Wilson, I've liked for years, but there is the red flags and the question marks that make them difficult clicks. You get Tyreek Hill, Terry McLaurin, Marvin Harrison, Devontae Adams, DJ Moore, Mike Evans, the 2 Kansas City Chiefs wide receivers, and Rice and Worthy, then Ted McMillan. Like, I think that is a tier probably down as far as Worthy before you split into the Ted McMillan, Devontae Smith, Say Flowers, Jameson Williams, Travis Hunter, Roma Dunze, Cortland Sutton group. Are you agreeing with that as a kind of split off there?
Yeah, although I think Rashee Rice belongs up with like Garrett Wilson.
Yeah, probably I think he's around mispriced.
Yeah, he's about and so this is another thing, is that when we see these mispriced players, like that's what we should be building our structure around, which RotoViz is fully on board with this idea. You know, it's like we're not just going to be committed to these structures no matter what. Like, it's always about what the player pool offers us. But I think that's more and more important, is like if Rashee Rice is there in the 4th round, then I'm probably going to take 4th round receiver a lot. But yeah, just like, again, what can I get later? Can I get a guy who's probably going to play the whole season? It sounds like the suspension's looking increasingly less likely. People mention that
100 plus targets.
Yeah, there's a court case that people reference, but that's a civil court case. There's yet to be a criminal court case scheduled, and looking increasingly certain that he doesn't get suspended until probably next year. And then the recovery looks like it's going better than we thought. So anywhere you can still get him past the early 3rd, he's a smash. And so but that's kind of where, you know, and I've been someone who hasn't. I don't mind having kind of heavy exposure on the bets I think are the best players in the pool.
Yeah.
So I'm comfortable. Like, if I see like, okay, I think Rashee Rice in the 4th is, my structure is going to be really built around like a lot of Rashee Rice in the 4th if this is available, right? Which I don't think it really will be.
The 4th round here, the FFPC
is an Underdog.
It is pretty ugly. Like, you know, I can't see myself drafting Mike Evans, Devontae Adams, or DJ Moore very often this year. Probably going to pass on the elite QBs the majority of the time. And that wipes out a lot of that particular round. Do you feel similar?
I'm trying. So we're doing some stuff at Legendary Upside. We're doing some research, and it seems like the elite quarterbacks might actually be better clicks than I was thinking they were.
Okay.
So I'm not 100% sure on that, but I'm kind of rethinking elite quarterback a little bit this year. They're cheap enough.
And they're cheap enough, but they're also going in a range where we're talking about, like, do we want these guys? So I guess it comes back to the question again is, like, can you get this later? And you can get an arbitrage version of it, but, like, you can't get Jaden Daniels later.
You can't get them later. These guys are the correct elite quarterbacks. Yeah. Like these four. I think Burrow's a little hot, but the top four guys, like, these are the guys. They pair passing and running. They're awesome. Daniels, you have to, take the leap with him a little bit, but he was like, if you look at like EPA and stuff, he was awesome last year. It's not just, like, this dude's really good at football. He's not just a cheat code. And
he also played a good chunk of the season injured.
Yeah. So, like, I'm in. I don't want to be. I'm in on these guys as talents. We just talked about how wide receivers starting to feel like a little shaky here, like not awful, but a little shakier. The running backs, it's like, we could get a Kerrane, we could, get a Chase Brown on Underdog, at least in kind of the 3-4 range. You get a Breece Hall in the 4th round all the time on Underdog. He's in the early 3rd here, which I think is more accurate. But if I'm getting, like, so on FFPC, it's like, okay, I can take like James Cook or Sam Laporta, who I think is kind of, you're paying a little for safety at tight end more than like a massive ceiling. I think maybe the elite quarterbacks are the right click there. I'm still kind of coming around to that because I haven't really been drafting them much. But again, with the idea of what can you get later, you can like hunt for it later. You can hope that like Caleb Williams makes a big leap. Bo Nix makes like another big leap, but like those guys aren't cheap. They're in round 8 and 9. Like that, they're not. You can hope Justin Fields puts it all together. He has been drafted kind of up with those guys, so that's certainly possible. Drake May I love, but May isn't like a true dual threat. He adds with his legs, but he's not Jaden Daniels. So
the guys at the top feel like they're at the top and their elevator can still go up. The guys who we're talking about there, they can like maybe like scratch and claw their way to near that, but hitting that is like is a big difference.
Yeah, it's tough to. That's a good point. It's like
it's kind of like the same as the wide receivers in the first 2 rounds versus the wide receivers like in the 7th round. Like,
yeah,
a bad season outside of injury for the guys in the first 2 rounds is probably still beating like the 3/4 outcome for some of those guys in the 7th. If they get a 70 percentile outcome.
Right. Yeah. Like when DraftKings opened up their best ball tournaments, they had Josh Allen was like in the early 2nd round, which was kind of nuts. But it was we just completely hard faded and we're like, this is insane. We're not doing this. But that's where his ADP opened up and people took him. That's not gonna. Justin Fields has no shot of that happening.
No.
But Josh Allen does again, and Lamar Jackson does, and Jaden Daniels does, and Jalen Hurts does. Like those guys could have some insane ADP after an awesome 2025 season. And yeah, I completely agree. I think some of these guys could kind of scratch and claw their way up to be drafted kind of where these guys are now, or maybe slightly behind. But they don't have the mega ceiling that these quarterbacks do. I've tended to kind of think, yeah, but it's too much to pay. I'm going to get behind at wide receiver. What about the wide receiver cliff? And I think it might be a mistake. I think maybe some of these elite quarterbacks are actually the right click here. Maybe I might change my mind on that. I'm trying to talk myself. I'm trying to let myself.
Pretty much, we have
be open-minded.
We have like 12 years of like finger clicking. This could sound very dodgy, but action on the your device or on your keyboard, whatever you want to do to select the wide receiver there. We're trying to work through. Like, can we change those pathways in our brain to go in the opposite direction? Before we finish up this episode, I am going to have.
But you can go 3 receivers and an elite quarterback.
Yeah,
like that's something I'm trying to do more of. I just hadn't been doing that much in the pre-draft period. I'm going to be building some teams like that for sure.
Before we close this one out, I have a couple. We were talking about the mispriced, and you mentioned Rashee Rice, and I have a couple that I think that fit into that as we get down through round 6 and round 7. But when we look in general, before we do that, the cliff, I have the elite cliff, as we mentioned. I have a secondary cliff. Have you somewhere where you think the actual, like, now we're in trouble for the wide receiver, outside of the 1 or 2 profiles in certain rounds that we want to target? Where is that for you, where you're like, oh, it's really fallen off badly here?
Well, it's a little different on every site. So just like looking at FFPC, I mean, the fact that you can get in round 10, you can get Luther Burden, Emeka Egbuka, and Josh Downs. Now, there's not that many receivers available there.
They are like, the 3.
But those are a good.
But I think they're for me, they're the profiles that you want to get on the team, rather than like, oh, like if we go above that, there's guys going above that that probably should be beyond that cliff in terms of the players getting drafted above it. Like when I look at Jerry Jeudy and you get into like Juwan Jennings, Ricky Pearsall, Deebo Samuel, then Khalil Shakir, I'm saying like maybe Pearsall makes a jump up, and maybe then Juwan Jennings doesn't. But I'm at a cutoff point kind of at Jerry Jeudy where like you go through Jordan Addison and then Jerry Jeudy, and then you're like, I'm done here.
There's guys in that range where we can like argue about like who they are, but I think starting in round 5, there's guys at wide receiver where we expect there to just be like some straight up busts, like hard busts, like does not really complete. Well, in retrospect, like I'm not necessarily fading it, but I'm just like looking at the range as a whole. I'm like, there's some guys here that could really look like bad picks. You mentioned Adunze. Like Adunze, I think has a pretty low floor. He does have a ceiling, but he has a pretty low floor. You look at Jalen Waddle. You know, you're kind of hoping something happens with Tyreek because he was not worth this type of pick at all based on what he did last year. There is a ceiling, but it could get ugly. Jerry Jeudy doesn't have a quarterback. That's probably not great. Juwan Jennings is like
Joe Flacco.
Juwan Jennings has a little bit of that Christian Kirk thing going on. At least he's in the 7th instead of the 3rd. But, you know, we're not like expecting like a huge monster season from him. I do take him sometimes, but I'm sometimes like, am I just sort of talk myself into a boring profile because I need a receiver? Ricky Pearsall could be nothing. Like this dude could just like not be good. He could have, you know, spiked at the end of last season. Ayuk's fine. Jennings is fine. Kittle's there. And Pearsall is just like an 11th round pick, who, you know, or a 13th round pick, you know, that kind of like maybe a spike week or So you get, I mean, Debo could be washed. Shakir is a slot receiver who we don't expect to accumulate a ton of volume. Like, there's just a lot of guys in that range.
You mentioned Jeudy doesn't have a quarterback. Then does he get it before the cliff? My cliff is there. He's after. I think Addison is mispriced in the 6th. Is he before or after for you?
So I think the thing that's tricky with Addison is that, especially, you know, on sites where we see like more volatile movement, DraftKings I think is the most volatile, but Underdog we should see some pretty big movement on news. Addison I think is going to get suspended to start the season. Maybe it's only like a couple games.
It's kind of still unclear though. Still unclear.
It's still unclear. And I don't, the thing that I'm struggling with is like, I don't think it really matters that much for like the results. But I think I'm going to get cheaper Addison later in the summer. So
the only thing though is if it becomes clear that isn't happening,
then he'll move up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like I think if he's not getting suspended, he probably should be in that area where Devontae Smith and Zay Flowers are going, which is like a round to a round and a half ahead of it.
That feels right to me.
And if he is getting suspended, he should be going where he is.
So early on, I was kind of like, I'm not, but I'm kind of more into Addison than I was. I think he's a target, ultimately. I've been kind of on the fence. Another thing where I'm like kind of torn both ways, but I've come around to thinking Addison is actually a target.
And I think with this,
again, because of the upside, you get the upside with him a little bit.
The fun thing every year is when wide receiver steep. I think again this proves that wide receiver may not be deep.
It's not deep. Wide receiver's not deep. I mean, and the whole idea of the wide receiver cliff is wide receiver's not deep, but it's hard to, I think all of this really comes down to like the more that we talk about like the round, like I want this many receivers by this round.
Yeah,
that's getting harder and harder to put into practice effectively because the prices are changing and this year's player pool is just so important. Like, what kind of profiles are you getting at what price is really the question, and what kind of profiles are you getting at what price versus what could you get later at that position. And that's where, the receivers in like rounds 6, that we just kind of talked about where we have some of these questions, you can get, and maybe FFPC is a little bit more running back thirsty. So you tend to get, it's like some of the guys I'm used to getting around 6 are actually in round 5, but in that kind of general range, like RJ Harvey, if I want upside, if I want late season production, why don't I just take RJ Harvey? Why am I taking, like
Pat, we've been
taking
advised
Jalen Waddle and taking
we've been advised by the
Sutton?
RotoViz Overtime community to stop talking about RJ Harvey. We have been we've been begged.
Sorry. Well, I'm talking about him again. But I think getting a little bit away from like I don't like to take running backs in this round, which I've been guilty of. It's just like I got to throw that out a little bit more, and it's like the lessons from kind of the zones and the cliffs and all of that is really about like this type of profile shouldn't cost this much, or this type of profile is important to add to your team before there aren't guys like this available at wide receiver later. Like that's the lesson, but then we have to keep applying it to the ever shifting landscape and making sure we're not like, well, I took a guy in round 6. He's the profile of a guy in round 11, but I took him in round 6, so I'm good because I got my 4th receiver. Yeah. Before round 7, even I'm ahead of the curve. Like, no, you're drafting round 11 quality talents in round 6. That's not great. So just like being more flexible, actually, I'm probably gonna have some really weird builds. Like I would bet you that I have like 2 receivers through round 7 on some builds. Hopefully the receivers are like 1st and 2nd round.
Hopefully.
But I bet you I do something like that because if the room's just going to like hand me values at the other positions. Now, I promise you it won't be like 2 receivers and 5 straight running backs. Okay. I haven't lost my mind. You don't have to boot me off the RotoViz text chain. but there's you can get an elite quarterback like we talked about. You can get an elite tight end. And then at receiver, you will be weaker. But I think on some teams being like, oh, I'm weak at receiver. What am I going to do now? I'm going to force bad receivers on my team, like in round 7, 8. No, I'm going to wait until the value of the other positions kind of dry up, and then I'll take bad receivers.
And that is basically like the thesis of the 0 RB stuff is like putting your team in an order where people are giving you the value at running back in the 10th round. So you're doing it in that different way. But I think this has been a very fun conversation, I think, and I hope the listeners have enjoyed it because we're working through, I do think there is a big evolution in the fantasy football like landscape over the last like 2 years, but particularly in the last 3 years with, Best Ball Mania and all the underdog growth, I do think that the game has changed more and people have adapted more in terms of the overall strategies in those 3 years than they would have in that previous decade. Maybe in the history of playing fantasy football, there's just so much has changed and we're aware of so much more. We are going to try, though, and talk about legendary upside at the running back position. We will see if RJ Harvey makes it into the conversation. But Pat, before we close out today, legendaryupside.com. You've got lots of stuff going on, podcasts, and a great writing team. Do you want to let the listeners know a little bit more about it?
Yeah, legendaryupside.com. We've got best ball rankings for Underdog and DraftKings updated daily. We're also going to be launching FFPC rankings pretty shortly and supporting some of the other contests on Underdog like Eliminator pretty shortly here, waiting until after the schedule release. But that is today as we're recording. So yeah, we'll have that all up pretty soon. Got Matt RB writing over for us. As he also does great work at RotoViz. He's going to have an article or two up here pretty soon. Daniel Raz is working on an article. I'm going to do some additional writing in the next week or so you can look for articles rolling out there. And yeah, we'll have you covered all summer. I also have good dynasty content for anyone still doing rookie drafts or trying to get some trades done. Got you covered with the rookie profiles and everything over there. We also do have a dynamic rankings tool called the Sidekick. If you're jumping in these best ball drafts, it can be pretty helpful to have a little sidekick along the way to suggest rankings as you go.
Awesome stuff. So we will have another episode later this week. Make sure you subscribe to the feed to get it once it is available. My name is Colm Kelly. You can follow me on socials at Overtime Ireland. You can follow Pat at Pat Kerrane. Until we're back, have a good one.